Christmas in the Victorian era, a time when your holiday cheer came with a high probability of third-degree burns, mild hallucinations, and a polite Victorian doctor offering you laudanum for the trauma. If you've ever wondered how the Victorians celebrated Christmas, imagine taking all the twinkle and warmth of a modern holiday and then adding fire hazards, toxic chemicals, and enough questionable interior decorating choices to make a modern safety inspector spontaneously combust. Hello, travelers. Histories do not always need to be boring. You can rest here and listen to hilarious histories to drift off to sleep. Tonight, we will explore the topic, why Christmas in the Victorian era sucked, and many more. Before we continue, leave a comment to let me know when and where you are listening to this, and hit the subscribe button, but only if you enjoy what I do here. Let's begin. Let's start with the centerpiece of any proper Victorian Christmas, the tree. Today, it's a charming pine wrapped in fairy lights and sentimental ornaments. Back then, it was a coniferous trap lovingly planted in your parlor. The tradition of the Christmas tree wasn't originally British. It was imported from Germany, like bratwurst and deeply repressed emotions. Prince Albert, Queen Victoria's German husband, introduced the custom in the 1840s, and the British upper class, always eager to impress each other with dangerous trends, ran with it. Soon, everyone wanted a tree, but this was before the discovery of electricity as a friend. So how did Victorians make their trees glow? Candles, real ones, open flame, on a tree, inside a house, next to curtains and children. It was basically a live-action Yuletide game of will this burn before pudding? Spoiler, yes it would. Tree fires were so common they were practically part of the celebration. Some upper-class households even had buckets of sand or saucepans of water at the ready. Nothing says Merry Christmas like expecting your living room to go up in flames before dessert. And then came the ornaments, which ranged from delightful to oh good, more poison. Handmade ornaments were the rage, especially for the middle and upper classes who had the time and staff to spend hours making tiny, glittery, unalive tokens. Let's talk about arsenic green, a popular pigment made from actual arsenic, used to dye everything from paper leaves to cloth garlands. This wasn't just mildly harmful. This was turn your fingertips green and make your nose bleed toxic. But it looked festive, so who cared? If arsenic wasn't your poison of choice, don't worry. There was always lead-based paint for wooden ornaments and toys, mercury for glass ball decorations, and silver nitrate to give things a nice mirrored shine while potentially damaging your nervous system. Basically, the Victorian Christmas tree was a glowing monument to the periodic table of regret. But wait, there's tinsel. You might think, oh, finally, something innocent and sparkly. Victorians made tinsel from actual strips of silver, lead or tin, delicately shredded into thread-like strips, and tossed on the tree like shiny confetti with an unalived wish. These metallic ribbons posed delightful risks, such as cuts, choking hazards, and the occasional electrocution when wiring finally came into the picture, but at least it looked classy while you screamed. Even the tree itself was sometimes problematic. To keep them standing upright, Victorians didn't have the luxury of plastic stands from the hardware store. Trees were often crammed into buckets of coal, weighted pots or elaborate iron holders that were prone to tipping over, which means if the fire didn't get you, the tree might just fall on you in a final act of holiday vengeance. Oh, and let's not forget the scented decorations. It was popular to stuff the tree with pomanders, oranges stabbed full of cloves and rolled in cinnamon and nutmeg. Sounds nice, right? Well, not when the oranges started to rot 2 days later, and the parlor smelled like Christmas at a compost heap. Of course, no holiday tableau would be complete without garlands, and Victorians loved a good garland, made from cranberries, popcorn, paper, lace, or in some cases feathers, waxed leaves, or human hair. Yes, again with the hair crafts. They were draped around the tree, over mirrors and along staircases. Pretty, yes, but also highly flammable, and in the case of anything organic, just one warm parlor away from hosting an entire Victorian insect colony. So what did all of this achieve? Aesthetic delight? Questionable at best. Family bonding? Only if you count screaming together as you throw a burning Christmas goose at the tree. Ultimately, Victorian holiday decor was a mixture of fatal elegance and a total disregard for mortality, wrapped up in a bow of upper-class ambition and middle-class mimicry. You see, for many Victorians, the point of decorating wasn't just festivity, it was social signaling. The more elaborate and uncomfortably dangerous your Christmas setup, the more cultured and modern you appeared. After all, nothing says refined like having a tree that doubles as a chemical experiment and a potential obituary. In conclusion, the Victorian Christmas tree was less a celebration of joy and more a seasonal booby trap. It glittered, it smoked, and it might poison you if you stared at it too long. But it was beautiful. Just don't breathe too deeply near the tinsel. In the Victorian era, the phrase "baby, it's cold outside" could just as easily have applied to the inside of your house. While we today spend our winters wrapped in fleece blankets beside central heating vents, sipping overpriced peppermint lattes, Victorians greeted the holiday season with frost-bitten toes, a fear of drafts so strong it might qualify as a personality trait, and an unwavering belief that a single fireplace could warm a 4-story house. Spoiler, it could not. Let's begin with the home heating situation, or rather the complete lack thereof. Victorian houses were designed for grandeur, not warmth. High ceilings, tall windows, and long hallways created a kind of architectural wind tunnel, perfect for impressing guests, and also for conducting indoor blizzards. Central heating, as we know it today, was still a fantasy. The wealthy might have had coal-burning grates in a few rooms, but unless you were Queen Victoria herself, those roaring fires did not reach upstairs, or sideways, or anywhere useful really. Coal fires came with their own brand of festive suffering. To keep them going, you had to feed them constantly, like a very sooty, temperamental pet. The room might warm up eventually, provided you didn't mind the occasional coal gas leak, chimney smoke backdraft, or soot-coated everything. A proper coal fire required cleaning, stoking, and vigilance, which meant your idea of resting by the fire was really just babysitting a pile of combustible rocks while slowly choking on fumes. But let's say you managed to get the parlor nice and toasty. Congratulations, you now had one warm room. The rest of the house remained a frozen abyss. Bedrooms, bathrooms, stairwells, and corridors all hovered somewhere between damp basement and wind-whipped moor. This led to the widespread Victorian practice of room huddling. Entire families would live their holiday lives within 1 or 2 rooms to avoid frostbite. Bedrooms in particular were not heated because Victorians believed it was healthier to sleep in cold air, which is a very polite way of saying, no, we won't give you a fireplace in your bedroom, just hug your pneumonia. To prepare for sleep, people performed elaborate rituals involving warming pans, shallow metal pans filled with hot coals, slid between the bed sheets to warm them up before use. A process which sounds cozy until you remember it involved live fire in a wooden frame, surrounded by flammable linens, supervised by candlelight. The 19th century, where everything, even bedtime, was a small house fire waiting to happen. Those lucky enough to have a servant or family member with sturdy hands could enjoy a brick-warmed footbath or a heated stone wrapped in flannel. Less lucky folks just clutched each other, prayed for the return of daylight, and listened to the rhythmic crunch of frost forming on the inside of the windows. And mornings. Oh, mornings were an act of personal heroism. Imagine lying in bed, cocooned in woolen blankets and body heat, knowing that the instant you moved, your breath would become visible and your toes would begin bargaining for amputation. Getting out of bed in a Victorian winter required bravery. Dressing yourself was a race against hypothermia, made worse by the fact that clothing was layered, buttoned, and usually damp from yesterday's fog. And God help you if you had to wash your face. Water pitchers in bedrooms often froze solid overnight. Victorian wash basins didn't come with the luxury of hot water on tap. They came with a faint hope and an icicle floating in your shaving bowl. Some families broke the ice with a poker just to splash themselves awake, which might explain the popularity of alcohol at breakfast. Even the walls contributed to the suffering. Victorian insulation was more of a philosophical concept than an actual thing. Walls were made of stone or thin wood, and offered about as much thermal resistance as a polite cough. Drafts slipped in through door gaps, keyholes, and unsealed windows, prompting the invention of such innovations as draft snakes, cloth tubes stuffed with sawdust, and door curtains, because nothing says interior design like trying to trap heat with a glorified blanket on a stick. And then came the outdoor obligations: caroling, shopping, church-going, all done in layers of wool, crinoline, and stoic suffering. There were no thermal leggings or moisture-wicking thermals, just long johns, hope, and a scarf your grandmother knitted out of itchy regret. Mittens were rarely waterproof, shoes were stiff leather nightmares, and once snow soaked through, you just kept walking and accepted that you now lived in the Arctic. The irony of it all, Victorians adored the imagery of a white Christmas, even as they actively suffered through it. Frost on the window panes was seen as charming. Snow on the streets? Picturesque. Never mind the horse-drawn sleighs sliding into ditches, or the fact that half the population was one bad cold away from full-blown consumption. It looked magical in paintings. So yes, the Victorian Christmas was beautiful, in the same way that a haunted mansion is charming. Behind the ivy-covered facades and oil-painted holiday postcards lay a very real chance of freezing your socks to the floorboards. The only thing colder than the air in a Victorian house? The stare your mother gave you when you asked if it was too early to open presents. In the Victorian era, Christmas gifts were less about delight and more about discomfort, both emotional and physical. You didn't get what you wanted, you got what they thought you deserved. And what they thought you deserved was often confusing, vaguely threatening, or made of human hair. Let's begin with the obvious. Victorian gift-giving was not casual. There were rules, so many rules. Who could give to whom, when to open things, whether gifts could be returned. Spoiler, no, they could not. And what kind of message your gift was sending. A present wasn't just a token of affection, it was a coded social message, the passive-aggressive text message of the 19th century. Imagine receiving a book on etiquette from your mother-in-law. She may as well have slapped you with a calling card. Now let's talk content. While we might exchange gadgets, cozy socks, or gift cards today, the Victorians leaned into morbid sentimentality and peculiar practicality. There was no such thing as fun. If it was enjoyable, it was probably considered vulgar. Instead, presents were often emotionally loaded, handmade in unsettling ways, or, on occasion, actually unalived. Let's start with the unalived stuff. Taxidermy, believe it or not, was a popular gift category. Victorians loved the natural world, and even more so when it was stuffed, glass-eyed, and permanently frozen in a bizarre pose. A well-crafted taxidermy piece was considered both scientific and sentimental, and nothing says Merry Christmas like a glass dome featuring two squirrels playing chess in tiny waistcoats, or a mouse dressed as a Victorian baker with a tray of faux pastries glued to its paws. For children, you might give a taxidermy bird perched on a decorative branch, educational and decorative. For adults, how about a weasel mounted dramatically on a miniature chaise longue? All very tasteful, of course, assuming your idea of tasteful is Grandma Mildred, but make it rodent. Next up, hair jewellery. And no, that is not a typo. Victorians had an intense relationship with hair. It was personal, intimate, and deeply symbolic. So naturally, weaving it into brooches, bracelets, lockets, and even entire framed wreaths became a thing. If you were especially close to someone, they might gift you a hair ring, a loop of their own hair, possibly encased in gold or carved jet, that you were expected to treasure and wear close to your heart. Lovers, mothers, even childhood friends participated in this follicular affection. If it sounds a little like emotional blackmail with strands, that's because it kind of was. Hair art was so widespread that you could actually order hair work patterns from catalogues, or even send your loved one's hair to a workshop to be made into custom mourning jewellery. Nothing says I love you like a pendant filled with braids from 3 different unalive cousins. But don't worry, not all gifts were terrifyingly organic. Some were just deeply awkward. Take, for example, gift books. These were beautifully bound collections of poetry, moral tales, or cautionary stories, often with titles like The Young Maiden's Guide to Modesty or Tales of Christian Fortitude in the Arctic. If you received one of these, you were either being judged or someone had run out of ideas. Other gifts included hand-painted plates, scented handkerchiefs for delicate women, needlepoint slippers, only to be worn when your reputation was unthreatened, and decorative teaspoons, because nothing says I value our relationship like a spoon that can't actually stir anything without bending. Children weren't spared either. Toys existed, sure, but often with a heavy-handed moral twist. Dolls came with built-in lessons about obedience. Toy soldiers were there to reinforce empire and duty. And if you were very unlucky, you got a wax baby in a box, which you were expected to keep in your room and not traumatize your dreams with. But perhaps the most exhausting part of all this gift-giving was the performative agony of opening gifts in front of others. You couldn't just tear the paper and shout, "Cool socks." No, you had to admire it sincerely, regardless of what it was. You must express measured delight at the tin of bitter lozenges from your uncle, or the needlepoint bookmark from your cousin who still thinks you read poetry. And you weren't just being judged by the giver. Everyone in the room was watching. Families sat around and watched each other's reactions like it was an emotional gladiator match. Any sign of hesitation, awkward laughter, or, heaven forbid, confusion, and you'd be the talk of the town by New Year's. To make matters worse, re-gifting was frowned upon, and returning an item was social suicide. So if someone gave you an embroidered hand towel featuring a goose wearing a crown, you smiled, thanked them profusely, and then tried to lose it in a house fire without raising suspicion. In the end, Victorian gift-giving was less about making someone happy and more about communicating emotion via increasingly obscure tokens of affection, many of which could kill you, haunt you, or shed. So next time someone gives you a pair of novelty socks and you feel disappointed, just remember it could have been a brooch made of Aunt Margaret's scalp hair, or an unalived squirrel in a hat. And honestly, that pair of socks is starting to look pretty good. In the modern world, Christmas dinner is a warm, comforting spread, maybe a glazed ham, some potatoes, perhaps a dessert that doesn't flicker ominously. But in the Victorian era, Christmas dinner was more like a culinary obstacle course wrapped in gravy and danger. It wasn't about taste, it was about tradition, status, and survival. Let's begin with the menu, which was ambitious in the way that only people without refrigeration or germ theory could manage. The centerpiece of the Victorian table was often roast goose, a fatty, greasy bird that cooked unevenly and produced enough drippings to start a small kitchen fire. Goose was considered traditional, respectable, and utterly exhausting to prepare. Of course, the wealthy preferred roast beef, which was bigger, redder, and came with the prestige of being able to afford an animal with fewer feathers. But that was just the beginning. On a true Victorian Christmas table, you might also find boiled eel for that festive swamp aroma, stuffed pigeon, tiny, gamey, and questionably sauced, oyster patties, which had a shelf life shorter than your average Victorian lifespan, and of course the infamous mince pies, which, unlike today's versions, actually contained meat, real meat, usually mutton or beef, mixed with dried fruit and spices, and baked into something that resembled a dessert but tasted like a confused stew in a crust. And then came the plum pudding, also known as Christmas pudding, which was neither made of plums nor especially pudding-like. It was a dense blackened cannonball of dried fruits, breadcrumbs, suet, that's beef fat by the way, sugar, eggs, and enough brandy to register on a breathalyzer. This was boiled or steamed for up to 8 hours, hung in a cloth bag, then ceremonially doused in more alcohol and set on fire at the table. Why? Because nothing says peace on earth like lighting your dessert ablaze while Grandma applauds politely and someone starts coughing from the brandy fumes. But as theatrical as it all looked, the real drama was happening behind the scenes in the kitchens. Victorian kitchens were rarely the spacious, Pinterest-worthy hearths you might imagine. They were hot, cramped, and dangerously underventilated. Most cooking was done with coal or wood-burning stoves, which meant constant smoke, ash, and the strong possibility of an apron catching fire. Chefs, often overworked servants or family members with strong forearms and weak lungs, labored for days preparing Christmas meals. Not hours, days. And if they fainted, well, that's just how you knew dinner was coming along nicely. Food safety, meanwhile, was treated more like a suggestion than a necessity. Raw meats were stored in larders, which were basically slightly cooler cupboards that kept things not quite rotting for as long as possible. And by as long as possible, we mean until Uncle Harold got visibly ill. There were no refrigerators, no expiration dates, and absolutely no shame in scraping the mold off something and reserving it. Spices were used generously, not to enhance flavor, but to cover up the taste of mild spoilage, and Victorian cooks were masters of euphemism. A dish described as fragrant might be deeply suspicious. Robust could mean on the edge, and anything labeled a surprise should be approached with the caution normally reserved for unexploded ordnance. Take mutton surprise, for example, a popular name for any dish involving leftover sheep, unknown contents or meat, so aged it could legally vote. The surprise, you didn't unalive, immediately. And let's not forget the booze. Alcohol flowed freely during Victorian Christmas, not just because it was festive, but because it numbed the taste buds and functioned as a light antiseptic. Sherry, port, brandy, mulled wine. Even children got in on the act with wine-soaked cakes and brandy-laced puddings. If the food didn't sit well, the drinks would help you forget, or at least pass out upright and quietly. Table manners were also a minefield. While you tried not to sweat through your lace collar, you were expected to navigate multiple forks, each more useless than the last, a 6-course meal with no refrigeration or portion control, and the constant possibility of biting into something inedible while your host stared at you smiling. If you were a guest at someone else's home, you were morally and socially obligated to eat everything, no matter how questionable the texture, no matter how odd the smell. Complaining about the pudding could cost you future invitations. Leaving your goose half-eaten was practically a dual request. For the cook, especially servants, failure to deliver a flawless, over-the-top Christmas meal could be career-ending. A scorched pudding or a tough roast wasn't just a kitchen mishap. It was a social scandal, the kind of thing people whispered about over lace doilies and sherry for weeks. By the time the final plate was cleared and the dishes were piled so high they threatened collapse, the average Victorian had consumed a full day's worth of calories in one sitting, fought off mild meat poisoning, and survived a flaming dessert. This wasn't dinner, this was culinary combat, so the next time you groan about your overcooked turkey or dry stuffing, spare a thought for the Victorian family bravely swallowing mystery meat under a fog of boiling pudding steam, unsure whether that funny taste was cloves or cholera. In the modern world, sending a Christmas card usually involves glitter, reindeer, or a slightly awkward family photo featuring one person blinking and another holding a wine glass like it's a weapon. But in the Victorian era, the Christmas card was something far more, well, unwell. It was a confusing blend of bleak, bizarre, and bizarrely festive, like Charles Dickens teamed up with a taxidermist and a surrealist painter after too much mulled wine. Victorian Christmas cards were not about cheer, they were about testing your sanity. Let's begin with a fan favourite, the unalive bird motif. You see, the Victorian Christmas card was obsessed with robins, but not the joyful, fluttering kind perched on holly branches. No, these robins were usually unalive, lying tragically on their backs in the snow. Sometimes they were tied up with string. Occasionally they were being mourned by other, still living robins who looked very upset. Why, you ask? Because nothing says Yuletide spirit like a murdered bird in the throes of rigor mortis. Historians think the robin symbolized postmen who wore red uniforms and were called robins as slang, and the cards were a way to say thank you. But the execution literally was unsettling. Imagine sending someone a card today with a picture of a deceased driver and the message, "Merry Christmas, thanks for the package." If the unalived robins weren't dramatic enough, Victorian printers decided to spice things up with anthropomorphic animals. Enter frog funerals. That's right, frogs, in full mourning attire, crying over a casket. You could also choose a card where insects were dancing a jig, or where a walrus handed a badger a human foot. Okay, that one might have been a hallucination, but you get the idea. The logic, there wasn't any. The Victorians loved symbolism and strangeness, and they especially loved turning ordinary holiday greetings into what looked like a rejected storyboard for a Tim Burton film. It's hard to say if these images were meant to be funny, creepy, or both, but one thing is clear: they were unhinged. A truly iconic entry into this fever dream of a postal tradition was the angry vegetable. You'd get a card featuring a turnip, or perhaps a potato, scowling at you with deeply human rage, as if it had been personally wronged by your Christmas pudding. Occasionally, these vegetables wore tiny hats or boots. Sometimes they glared at children. Again, was there a moral, a hidden message, a metaphor? Probably not. It was just one more thing to haunt your dreams and remind you that the Victorians didn't know how to do festive without a little psychological warfare. If the images didn't get you, the messages might. Victorian card sentiments weren't just sentimental, they were saccharine to the point of aggressive. One card, featuring a crying cat of course, read, "I mourn your absence this Christmas, as the snow mourns the sun." Another politely wished the recipient continued survival into the new year, which, given the rampant disease and lack of central heating, was honestly just realistic. Others were downright threatening in the most delicate handwriting imaginable. Things like, "May your holidays be pleasant, unlike last year," or, "To my dearest cousin, may this Christmas find you better in spirit and less scandalous in behavior." Passive aggression wrapped in ribbon. That's the Victorian brand. So what drove this stationery madness? Part of it stems from the fact that the Victorians were really into novelty. They had printers, imagination, and a morbid sense of humor. Combine that with the era's obsession with symbolism, nature, death, and sentiment, and you get dancing frogs and unalived birds in bonnets. Another factor, the mass production of cards was relatively new. The penny post had made sending letters cheap, and Christmas cards exploded in popularity. But much like the early internet, people were still figuring out what the tone should be. Some people went for heartfelt, others went for nightmare fuel. Also, and this cannot be overstated, Victorian humor was weird. They enjoyed jokes that would make modern audiences say, "Wait, is this a cry for help?" Victorian Christmas cards were less about spreading cheer and more about forcing your friends and family to wonder if you were okay. They were weird, dark, hilariously confusing, and often completely disconnected from the holiday itself. But they were also somehow perfectly Victorian, earnest, eccentric, and filled with strange emotional undercurrents. Every dead robin, every smug turnip, every frog in mourning told a story. A story that usually ended with someone saying, thanks. In a world before memes, this was the meme. A frog crying over his amphibian wife while a snowman leered in the background. And the caption? Season's greetings. So next time you get a slightly boring card with a golden retriever wearing a Santa hat, just be grateful it's not a crow funerary march or a shrimp in a top hat wishing you eternal joy, or else. The innocent joy of children during the holidays, unless of course you were a child in the Victorian era, in which case joy was something best read about in a novel, while wearing 6 layers of wool and silently weeping into a crusty handkerchief. For the miniature humans of the 19th century, Christmas wasn't the season of sugar and sparkle. It was a marathon of stiff collars, emotionally repressed expectations, and the ever-present risk of being stared down by a porcelain doll with glass eyes and the soul of a Victorian widow. Let's begin with the performances. Oh yes. Christmas wasn't complete until the smallest, shakiest child was forced to stand in a draughty sitting room and recite The Night Before Christmas, or an epic poem about Jesus and robins, while all the adults silently judged their diction. If you flubbed a line, no one clapped. If you nailed it, still no clapping. This wasn't about encouragement, it was about tradition. Christmas recitations were less cute family memory, and more "you'll thank me when you have the confidence to request extra potatoes at a dinner party someday." And let's not forget the wardrobe. Imagine being 5 years old and trying to enjoy your holiday while wearing enough starched fabric to qualify as a small furniture piece. Victorian children were swaddled in wool, lace and itchy underthings that made movement a logistical nightmare. Running, unheard of. Laughing, only if it was quiet and respectful. The only thing less flexible than their limbs was the expectation that they remain clean, composed and upright in the presence of guests who smelled like mothballs and privilege. When it came to toys, the options ranged from the charmingly hand-carved to the nightmarishly deranged. Dolls, for example, were not so much companions as entities that stared into your soul. Many were modelled after dead children, a real trend, complete with glass eyes and sorrowful expressions. Others had movable limbs, which only served to make them easier to position on your pillow at night, just sitting there, watching, waiting. Mechanical toys were a marvel of ingenuity and mild terror. Wind-up monkeys clanged cymbals with dead-eyed fervor, and toy soldiers marched stiffly into furniture. Rocking horses were beautifully carved and weighed as much as a modern coffee table. So if one fell on you, well, Merry Christmas and call the barber surgeon. And if you were truly lucky, someone might gift you a homemade marionette, because what child doesn't want a string-operated man-thing to haunt their dreams? And then there was the food. Oh, not the grand adult feast, that was the arena of indigestion and unwashed poultry. For children it was the promise of sweets, a word used very generously. Take the sugar plum, a dense, jaw-testing orb made from layered spices and a vague suggestion of fruit. Victorians didn't have access to the kind of refined sugar we know today, so their confections often tasted like a cough drop fell into a spice rack and no one cleaned it up. Sweets were also rare and rationed. You didn't eat them so much as display them on a plate and hope for a second look. What about outdoor fun? Glad you asked. Ice skating was a popular holiday activity, assuming you were wealthy enough to own skates and reckless enough to use them. Most frozen ponds were only probably safe, and children were encouraged to skate in clothes that could drown a person in seconds. If you didn't skate, there was sledding, which basically involved throwing yourself down a hill on a wooden board, while hoping your wool trousers didn't catch fire from friction. And of course, caroling. Groups of children were sent door to door singing songs, not for candy but for coins or stale buns. This was considered wholesome, except it wasn't optional, and it was cold. Imagine being elbowed by your cousin because you sang figgy pudding wrong, while some stranger shoves a 3-day-old biscuit in your mittened hand as a reward. So, to summarize, a Victorian Christmas for children meant being cold, being quiet, and being terrified by your own gifts, and that's before the ghost stories came out. Yes, while today's kids fall asleep watching Elf, Victorian children were regaled with tales of phantoms, hauntings and relatives from the afterlife who probably just wanted to remind them to sit up straight. It wasn't Christmas unless someone was nervously glancing over their shoulder at the darkened stairwell. It's easy to look back at the 19th century through a snow globe lens, imagining quaint sleigh rides and charming candlelit scenes. But for the children, Christmas wasn't magical. It was an obstacle course of etiquette, discomfort, and psychological endurance. And maybe, just maybe, if they survived all that with poise, they'd be rewarded with a peppermint stick and a nod of approval from Aunt Agnes, who hadn't smiled since a think less silent night, and more yelling slightly off-key while holding a tankard of warm regret. Caroling back then was not a serene or sacred activity. It was the 19th century version of crashing your neighbor's house party, except you brought your own lyrics, shouted them at their door, and expected food and alcohol in return. Holiday spirit, absolutely. Holiday sobriety, not so much. Let's begin with the concept of wassailing, which sounds adorable and old-timey until you realize it's basically caroling's drunken older cousin. The term wassail comes from the Old Norse phrase vesheil, meaning be well or good health. Sounds nice. Except the tradition quickly evolved from a blessing into a full-on pub crawl in the snow. Participants would parade through town with a bowl of hot spiced cider, sometimes with bread floating in it, because why not add carbs to your beverage, knocking on doors and singing songs with the not-so-subtle subtext of "give us your booze or we'll keep going." In practice, this meant carolers could be a fairly unpredictable bunch. Some were genteel, church groups spreading cheer, but others were more like Yuletide pirates, bellowing folk songs, sipping heavily from the communal wassail bowl, and refusing to leave until they'd been properly rewarded. This wasn't just singing, this was holiday extortion, set to music. The lyrics, too, were occasionally aggressive. One traditional tune included the line, "We are not daily beggars that beg from door to door, but we are neighbours' children whom you have seen before." Translation. We know where you live, Carol. Don't skimp on the figgy pudding. If a house failed to deliver food, drink or coin, the carolers might offer the festive equivalent of a hex, an out-of-tune encore, or worse, several. In other words, your silence would not protect you. And what about the performances themselves? Well, imagine several layers of wool, freezing winds, no central heating, and half your group fueled by what was essentially mulled cider, spiked with desperation. The result? Slurred verses, forgotten lyrics, and the occasional impromptu nap in someone's hedgerow. But hey, it was tradition. Even children weren't spared. While today's kids might go door to door for candy at Halloween, Victorian kids were roped into caroling missions in the dead of winter. Picture it, a frosty 10-year-old, holding a lantern and a sheet of lyrics they can't read, squinting up at a mansion's door and croaking out, "God rest ye merry gentlemen," while trying not to freeze solid. The reward? Possibly a penny, possibly a hunk of fruitcake, possibly just frostbite and disappointment. Merry Christmas, Timmy. And let's talk logistics for a moment. These weren't brief visits. In some regions, the carolers would stay until they were literally fed, which could be hours. If you didn't want a dozen frozen Victorians camped out on your stoop belting out 6 verses of the Boar's Head Carol, you'd better have kept your pantry stocked with cider, meat pies and whatever passed for snacks in a world without refrigeration or fun. One contemporary account describes a group who sang for 5 hours outside a home before being offered refreshment. At that point, you're not celebrating Christmas, you're staging a musical siege. Then there's the delightful chaos of what people were actually drinking. Wassail recipes varied widely but usually included ale, wine, spices, sugar, and sometimes raw eggs. Because if there's one thing you want in your hot holiday punch, it's the faint threat of salmonella. And after a few servings, suddenly everyone's voice sounded lovely, even if they were singing in the wrong key or the wrong song entirely. And yet, despite all the potential for chaos, this was considered a wholesome tradition. Newspapers encouraged it. Churches even organized their own groups, perhaps in an effort to rebrand what had become an annual bout of musical trespassing. And of course, because Victorians loved to blend cheer with terror, there were even reports of ghostly carolers, apparitions said to appear near Christmas, singing from beyond the grave. Because nothing says happy holidays like spectral harmony. So the next time you hear a knock at your door and a few slightly off-pitch voices start singing about figgy pudding, just remember, you're living a modern version of a centuries-old tradition of noisy, thirsty and possibly tipsy well-wishers. Just be thankful they don't have a wassail bowl with them. Yet, Christmas in the workhouse. A phrase that might conjure up images of Dickensian redemption, misty-eyed orphans receiving oranges, and a miraculous snowfall of charity and goodwill. But let's be clear, Charles Dickens was writing fiction. The reality was less heartwarming and more, slightly warmer gruel for the poor. Christmas in the Victorian era was not so much a holiday as it was a brief pause in the usual daily grind of survival, if you were lucky, and if you weren't lucky, it was just another grey square on life's soggy advent calendar. The workhouse, that cheerless institution reserved for society's most destitute, did technically mark Christmas, but in much the same way a dentist might celebrate your birthday with a root canal and a dry, happy returns. Let's start with the festive spread. A regular workhouse diet consisted of bread that could be used as a building material, porridge that defied spoons, and gruel, lots and lots of gruel. On Christmas Day, things were slightly elevated, slightly being the operative word here. A few workhouses allowed for a modest improvement, an extra ladle of soup, a dab of potatoes that had once seen a spud, or even a piece of meat boiled, flavourless, and about the size of a playing card. Pudding might be served too, which sounds festive until you realize it was mostly suet, boiled flour and hope. And while the food was meager, it was served with a generous helping of sermonizing. The workhouse Christmas often began with a stern address on the virtues of humility, thrift and gratitude. Picture rows of weary paupers, cold and hungry, being told they were incredibly lucky to be alive and should really stop complaining. Nothing says holiday cheer like a lecture about moral failure with a side of stringy mutton. The rich, ever the champions of optics over substance, often made appearances during these holiday feasts. That's right, Victorian high society would sometimes treat a trip to the workhouse as a seasonal charity safari. Dressed in fine winter coats and perfumed like Christmas wreaths, they'd stroll through the dining halls watching the poor eat. They might toss a coin into a donation tin, or offer a smile like it was worth its weight in gold. Some even brought children, as if poverty tourism was just another item on the holiday agenda between goose carving and parlour games. To be fair, there were exceptions. Some more progressive workhouses and charitable organisations genuinely tried to provide a sense of holiday spirit, including decorations, simple gifts, or even the occasional musician. But these instances were rare flickers in a very long, very dim tunnel. Most of the time, any festive cheer was provided by the inmates themselves, who, despite the crushing weight of systemic poverty, managed to find pockets of joy in song, storytelling, and dark humour. Because yes, even in these grim settings, humour survived. You had to laugh, mostly to keep from crying. Jokes about the pudding being last year's leftovers soaked in tears weren't uncommon. Some residents would put on tiny shows or impromptu skits, using bits of cloth or paper to fashion costumes. These weren't elaborate productions, but they were acts of defiance. They said, "You may have stripped us of dignity, but we can still mock this whole system in rhyme." And the children? Well, they were the ones hit hardest. No toys, no roaring fireplaces, no unwrapping of anything except maybe an extra crust of bread. Their stockings weren't hung by the chimney. They were worn, wet, and probably frozen solid. The idea of Father Christmas visiting the workhouse was laughable. If anything, the only jolly man making rounds was the overworked night watchman, who snuck a sip of gin behind the stables. Even charity efforts aimed at children were often awkward and symbolic. Donors might send bundles of gifts which turned out to be used clothing, half-broken toys, or religious tracts tied with string. In short, "Here, child, learn to read about sin while shivering in your second-hand boots." Still, amidst the bleakness, there was resilience. People found ways to mark the holiday, however small. A whispered carol, a paper star made from scrap, a candle stub lit with careful reverence. These weren't grand gestures, but they mattered more than all the tinsel in the palace. They were proof that even when society failed people spectacularly, the human spirit occasionally showed up with a cup of diluted tea and a stubborn sense of humour. In the end, the workhouse Christmas wasn't a miracle. It was a cold, bureaucratic, half-hearted attempt at charity, wrapped in moral superiority and served with a teaspoon of lukewarm gravy. But for those living it, it was still a chance, a fleeting one, to remember they were people, not problems. Picture it, a grand Victorian parlour, the fire crackling faintly, the goose sweating ominously on the dining table, and the air so tense you could slice it with a monogrammed silver butter knife. Welcome to the Victorian family Christmas. Less festive cheer, more silent judgment glazed in gravy. The holiday season was a time for family, but that didn't mean anyone enjoyed it. Victorian families treated Christmas dinner like a royal court hearing. Everyone dressed up uncomfortably, sat in stiff-backed chairs, and awaited emotional sentencing from whichever elderly relative had the sharpest opinions and the loosest filter. Children were placed at the tiny table of exile, where they were expected to sit still, avoid chewing audibly, and absolutely not speak unless spoken to. Even then, eye contact was discouraged. After all, who wants to be accused of willful personality at the age of 6? The table conversation, if you can call it that, was typically either tepid pleasantries or verbal landmines. A cousin would innocently mention a recent trip to Bath and suddenly Uncle Harold would launch into a 45-minute tirade on the moral collapse of modern society, triggered by the sight of women wearing trousers. Meanwhile, Aunt Mildred would lean across the roast beef and casually remind you that you're approaching 30 with neither husband nor heir, and by the way, did you know your second cousin just got engaged to a Duke's dentist? Laughter wasn't banned per se, but it was frowned upon. It disrupted the rhythm of awkward pauses. The atmosphere was so formal that even the Christmas crackers seemed hesitant to pop. Games like charades were sometimes played, but only in the most solemn way possible. One didn't act out. 3 men in a tub. One merely implied it with eyebrow movements and a grim nod. The seating arrangement alone was a source of pre-dinner drama. Patriarchs sat at the head of the table like minor deities, flanked by their long-suffering wives, who had spent the past week micromanaging pudding densities and trying not to faint in corsets. The rest of the family filled in like chess pieces. Married couples together, spinster aunts strategically placed to whisper critiques, and widowed uncles hovering near the sherry with the haunted look of men who once tried to tell a joke in 1842 and were never forgiven. Children, if not banished to the nursery entirely, had their souls gently crushed by the sheer pressure of Victorian respectability. No interrupting, no fidgeting, no opinions. If you were lucky, you got a small gift, usually a book on morality or a wooden horse with 3 working legs, and the privilege of serving as human decoration. The Christmas meal itself was long, rich, and terrifying. No one dared complain about being too full for pudding, because that implied you lacked moral stamina. If a dish was undercooked, overboiled, or simply terrifying, see boiled calf's head, it was praised for its heartiness. Dessert was compulsory, as were compliments. Delightful. Often translated to "this mince pie tastes like despair and nutmeg," but saying so out loud would mark you as emotionally unstable. The gift exchange was another social obstacle course. Presents were rarely chosen with joy. They were calculated gestures meant to signal taste, status, and passive aggression. Giving a relative a lace-trimmed handkerchief was a coded message. I hope you cry more elegantly this year. In return, you might receive a brooch made from someone's hair or a leather-bound book on spiritual hygiene, both of which required exaggerated expressions of gratitude, lest you offend the giver and be disinvited from next year's festival of barely concealed contempt. The final act of this theatrical performance was post-dinner family time, which mostly involved everyone sitting in the drawing room, pretending to enjoy each other's company. The fire would die down, conversation would grind to a halt, and someone would inevitably suggest a reading of A Christmas Carol, because nothing says festive like a ghost threatening your soul over a cold biscuit. By the end of the night, everyone was exhausted, overfed, and emotionally bruised. Hugs were stiff, goodbyes were brisk, and the overall consensus was, well, that wasn't too dreadful, was it? And yet, come next year, the invitations would go out again, because nothing says tradition like repeating an experience that everyone secretly dreads but refuses to skip. Ah, Christmas, a time for joy, togetherness, and almost certainly freezing to gone somewhere between Derbyshire and your aunt's dismal drawing room. In the Victorian era, the true spirit of the holidays wasn't wrapped in ribbons or hidden in the pudding. It was strapped to the roof of a mail coach, praying not to be launched into a ditch while en route to be judged for your life choices. Travel during the holidays was less cozy snow globe adventure and more 17th century survival horror. Let's start with trains, the crown jewel of Victorian transportation. They promised speed, comfort, and progress. What they delivered during December was frostbite, delays, and the mild but ever-present risk of exploding boilers. Carriages were unheated, windows iced over from the inside, and seating arrangements modelled after sardine cans. You didn't just sit next to strangers, you huddled with them for warmth, forming temporary alliances of shivering misery and passive-aggressive coughing. If you were lucky enough to score a first-class seat, you could enjoy slightly thicker wool upholstery as you slowly turned into a human icicle. Second-class passengers got splinters and a strong sense of regret. Third-class passengers, they stood for 8 hours, on a rocking, rattling machine powered by coal, complaints, and mechanical optimism. But if you really wanted to spice things up, you could try the roads. Victorian England's road system was a glorious mess, a frothy combination of ankle-deep mud, black ice, and horse-related anxiety. Carriages skidded, carts toppled, and coachmen cheerfully whipped their way into snowdrifts while passengers prayed to survive the journey with at least one functioning limb. You could attempt to ride a horse, assuming you owned one and didn't mind arriving looking like a wind-chilled scarecrow. Or walk, if you fancied navigating miles of slippery, frozen countryside with nothing but a pocket watch and a grim sense of duty to keep you company. Either way, you arrived half-frozen, clothes ruined, and soul lightly damaged, only to be greeted at the door with, "Good heavens, is that what you're wearing?" And that's before you even stepped inside, because once you survived your heroic frost-bitten odyssey across Victorian Britain, you still had to endure the most treacherous part of the season, family conversation. Picture it. Your bones are still thawing, your boots squelch ominously with every step, and you're seated between two elderly relatives whose only hobby is critiquing your personal decisions. You're asked about your health, you look pale, your career, still doing that writing thing, and, most crushingly, your romantic prospects. You know your cousin Arthur just got engaged to a girl with excellent teeth. Tea is served lukewarm, biscuits are stale, and the fireplace roars in the other room. You've risked derailment, pneumonia, and runaway horse carts to get here, and your reward is a slice of fruitcake so dense it could be used as a building material, and a rousing game of spot the familial disappointment. And of course, leaving was no picnic either, because just as you've warmed up, emotionally shut down, and begun to contemplate whether running away to the colonies is a valid life choice, it's time to brave the journey home. With luck, the train hasn't derailed into a snowbank, and the roads haven't turned into an icy slip-and-slide of doom. If they have, well, enjoy spending Boxing Day in a rural inn where the only available bed is stuffed with straw, and the landlord's main concern is whether your boots are leaking on his floor. All in all, Victorian holiday travel was an exercise in resilience, grit, and suppressing every natural instinct to scream into the wind. But people did it anyway, every year, because somewhere in the frost-bitten hearts of the Victorians was a deep, stubborn belief that family togetherness, no matter how awkward, cold, or potentially fatal, was worth it. And perhaps, in their own strange frost-covered way, they were right, or at least too repressed to admit otherwise. If Victorian England had a most likely to set fire to a colonial protocol award, Richard Francis Burton would have won it before he hit puberty. Born in 1821 in Torquay, Devon, a quiet English town for people who enjoy fog and gout, Burton was raised not so much in England as he was everywhere else. His father, an ex-army officer, had an allergy to staying put, and his mother had the good sense not to stop him. The result? Young Richard spent his formative years bouncing across France, Italy and Switzerland like a military brat with a passport addiction. By the time most kids were learning to tie their shoes, Burton was arguing in fluent French, cursing in Italian, and probably side-eyeing tourists for butchering local etiquette. He wasn't just a quick study, he absorbed languages like a sponge dipped in chaos. Latin, Greek, French, Neapolitan dialects. If you spoke it, Burton would learn it just to talk back. School, unsurprisingly, did not suit him. He was sent to Oxford, more for formality than function, and within 2 years he managed to offend nearly everyone, pick multiple fights, and get expelled for attending a horse race. A horse race? Victorian Oxford could forgive being pompous, condescending, and vaguely racist, but gambling on hooves, that was a step too far. Naturally, the British East India Company took one look at this walking time bomb and said, "Yes, let's give him a sword." In 1842, Burton shipped out to India as a junior officer with a moustache full of ambition and a brain full of Sanskrit. While most of his fellow officers spent their time drinking gin, sweating profusely, and mispronouncing the local language with colonial arrogance, Burton was diving headfirst into the culture. He didn't just study Hindustani, he mastered it, Then he moved on to Persian, then Punjabi, then Arabic. He learned swordplay from local instructors, observed religious customs with academic precision, and here's the real kicker, started dressing in native attire. Not as a costume, as a lifestyle. This sent shockwaves through the officer's mess. Victorian respectability was a fragile thing, built on powdered starch and imperial superiority. And here came Burton, rolling up in flowing robes, speaking fluently with local merchants, and occasionally dropping into mosques to observe the prayers, not to mock, but to understand. His commanders didn't know whether to promote him or arrest him for impersonating someone interesting. At one point, Burton was reprimanded by his superiors for being too good at Arabic. Let's pause and let that sink in. In a land where understanding the people around you was literally part of the job, the army got nervous because Burton was blending in too well. Apparently, when your British officer knows exactly what everyone is saying about you, it becomes a problem. Who knew? Instead of the standard colonial approach, speak loudly and point, Burton preferred nuance. He even wrote a report detailing the structure of brothels in Sindh, purely for research, he claimed, which was immediately filed under things no one asked for but now cannot unsee. Burton's flair didn't stop at language. He fenced like a duelist in a melodrama, flirted with danger and occasionally people, and wrote detailed anthropological studies that were so ahead of their time they barely made it through the Victorian censors without spontaneously combusting. He considered himself a scholar first, soldier second, which confused the military to no end. He once proposed that instead of blindly enforcing British rule, they should actually study and respect local cultures. His commanding officers responded to this outrageous suggestion with a firm, "Please shut up." In the rigid social structure of the British Raj, Burton was an anomaly, a man too smart for his own rank, too curious for his own safety, and far too spicy for the flavourless pudding that was the East India Company bureaucracy. To many of his fellow officers, Burton was a traitor to the Empire's image, a man who preferred knowledge over obedience, complexity over superiority, and blending in over standing above. To others, he was a genius polymath with zero impulse control. To Burton, he was just getting started. While other Victorian officers were busy sipping weak tea and being confused by foreign customs, Burton was 3 dialects deep, dressed like a local, and probably already plotting a duel. For most people, learning one language is an accomplishment. For Sir Richard Francis Burton, learning one language before breakfast was just warming up. By the time he was in his early 20s, he could flip between tongues faster than a multilingual gossip. His total linguistic repertoire has been estimated anywhere from 25 to 40 languages depending on who you ask and how many dead dialects count. If it had a verb tense and a set of curse words, Burton was probably fluent in it. Language, to Burton, wasn't just a means of communication. It was a weapon, a shield, and occasionally a way to get into places, literal and metaphorical, that he otherwise shouldn't have been. He didn't just want to speak like the locals, he wanted to think like them. While other colonial officers carried pocket dictionaries they never used, Burton was diving headfirst into phonetics, grammatical structures, and cultural nuance. He didn't just want to know what someone was saying, he wanted to know how they said it after 2 drinks and an existential crisis. This obsession wasn't a hobby, it was a mission. He'd lock himself away with dictionaries and native speakers, emerging days later with new accents and a terrifying ability to eavesdrop on any conversation within earshot. The man didn't learn languages for practical reasons. He learned them because he had to know everything, and he didn't trust translations not to lie to him. But Burton's interests weren't limited to the polite vocabulary one might use to ask for tea or directions to the embassy. No, he was far more interested in the words nobody wanted to translate, the kind whispered in marketplaces, shouted in taverns, and scribbled in the margins of ancient texts. Where other Victorian scholars recoiled, Burton leaned in, hard. Which brings us to the part of his career that made both his peers and their monocles tremble, his academic ventures into erotic literature. Burton believed that a society's views on sexuality were as important as its politics or religion, and he wanted to study those views, footnote them, annotate them, and ideally, publish them in leather-bound volumes. One of his early scandal makers was an essay on male brothels in Karachi. That's right. While others were publishing works like The Economic Benefits of Cotton in Bombay, Burton dropped a fully referenced exposé titled something like On the Varieties and Practices of Sodomy in South Asia, a cultural analysis with maps. This was not a man known for subtlety. He described the setup, pricing, clientele, and coded language used among the brothels with the detached precision of a zoologist sketching mating rituals in the wild. Victorian censors nearly passed out from the index alone. But Burton wasn't writing for shock value. Well, not only for shock value. His goal was to understand and record the entirety of human experience, even the parts everyone else pretended didn't exist. If a society had a word for it, he believed it deserved to be studied, not shoved under a moral rug and labelled indecent. This is what made him dangerous to the fragile sensibilities of Victorian academia. Where most scholars gently sidestepped taboo, Burton shoved it into the spotlight and demanded everyone take a good long look. His translations of Eastern texts like the Kama Sutra, the Perfumed Garden, and later the Arabian Nights weren't just about preserving ancient manuscripts. They were about breaking down the Western illusion that other cultures were primitive simply because they weren't prudish. He approached these texts with a seriousness that would have made a church historian blush. Every position, metaphor, and euphemism got a thorough linguistic breakdown, often with notes on regional variations and practical techniques. To Burton, this wasn't vulgarity, it was anthropology. To everyone else in Victorian England it was cause for concern, prayer, and possibly a fainting couch. Still, despite the pearl-clutching, his work found its way into scholarly circles, sometimes under the counter, sometimes in plain sight. He even co-founded the Kama Shastra Society, a private printing group specifically designed to publish works too spicy for general circulation. Because if Burton couldn't find a way around censorship, he'd just create an underground literary network and bypass the whole thing. At his core, Burton wasn't just fascinated by language, he was addicted to what it revealed. He believed that if you wanted to understand a people, you couldn't just ask where they lived or what they ate. You had to know how they cursed in anger, flirted in secret, or confessed their desires in the dark. And that kind of knowledge didn't come from grammar books. It came from immersion, curiosity, and occasionally very awkward conversations with Victorian publishers. Most men collect stamps. Burton collected languages, obscure dialects, and just a sprinkle of scandal. And while some saw his work as inappropriate, vulgar, or downright blasphemous, he saw it as essential, because to him, truth came in many tongues, and he intended to learn every single one of them. There are bold men, and there are smart men, and then there's Sir Richard Francis Burton, who regularly stared at danger with a magnifying glass and said, "Yes, but have we considered disguising ourselves and wandering into the most forbidden place on earth just to take notes?" In 1853, Burton set his sights on Mecca, the holiest city in Islam. At the time, entry was strictly forbidden to non-Muslims. This was not a gentle members-only situation. This was a death penalty if you're caught pretending kind of scenario. And Burton? Oh, he wasn't just pretending, he was going full method actor. This wasn't a spur-of-the-moment decision. Burton spent months preparing for the journey. He didn't just study Islamic law, he internalized it. He learned the prayers, the postures, the greetings, the social rhythms. He wasn't just going to walk into Mecca. He was going to become the kind of person who belonged there. He even picked a full alias, Mirza Abdullah, a wandering dervish from Afghanistan who also happened to be a doctor. Why a doctor? Because it gave him a reason to ask strange questions and scribble in notebooks without people assuming he was a British spy or worse, a travel writer. This is where Burton's flair for detail reached absurd levels. He had a backstory, he had regional dialects practiced. He even gave himself a plausible medical education, just in case someone asked him to treat a boil while waiting for a camel. This was deep cover anthropology. long before the term existed. He also darkened his skin with stain, wore authentic robes, and practiced the rituals of pilgrimage down to muscle memory. In today's terms, it would be like sneaking into the Vatican disguised as the Pope's cousin and offering to lead Mass in flawless Latin. But of course, Burton didn't stop there. No, he decided the disguise wouldn't be complete without one extra, terrifying flourish, undergoing a mock circumcision to leave a surgical scar, just in case someone got really curious. That's not commitment. That's what happens when your curiosity drinks espresso and loses its grip on fear. As he travelled with a caravan of real pilgrims, Burton took in every detail, quietly, discreetly, but obsessively. The angle of a prayer mat, the spacing of feet during ritual washing, the price of street food, the way coffee was poured and whether sugar came before or after. Every moment was fuel for his brain and future reports. While other pilgrims were communing with God, Burton was communing with architecture, layout, and the social etiquette of sacred geography. He entered Mecca under the blazing Arabian sun, passed checkpoints, recited the right phrases, and somehow, convinced everyone around him that he was just another weary traveler on the Hajj. He stood shoulder to shoulder with true believers, circled the Kaaba, participated in rites that outsiders had never seen, and didn't flinch. Not once. Not when he was questioned. Not when he had to act out cultural fluency in front of strangers. Not even when someone reportedly looked at him a little too long and asked a few too many questions about his origin story. When things got tense, Burton would rely on a trick he perfected: go quiet, look wise, and say something cryptic in Persian. Works in Mecca, works at awkward dinner parties. What makes this feat so astonishing, beyond the obvious gone-by-angry mob if caught detail, is how precisely he documented it all after returning. Burton's report, Personal Narrative of a Pilgrimage to Al-Madinah and Mecca, was a masterclass in cultural observation. He described rituals with anthropological precision, avoided sensationalism, and even commented on the layout of coffee shops. This wasn't a tabloid tell-all. It was a love letter to cultural complexity, disguised as travel literature. The Victorian world read it with fascination, and more than a little alarm. Of course, the backlash wasn't far behind. Critics accused him of blasphemy, cultural theft, and general insanity. But others, especially later historians, recognized it as one of the most daring feats of exploration in the 19th century. Not because it was dangerous, though it definitely was, but because Burton treated a foreign religion with a level of respect, curiosity, and detail most Victorians couldn't muster for their own breakfast. Victorian etiquette tip 42. If you're caught faking your religion in Mecca, it's considered rude to get murdered. Fortunately, Burton was fluent in not dying. He left Mecca with his limbs intact, his identity undiscovered, and a treasure trove of knowledge no outsider had captured before. And while he would go on to many more adventures, most of them involving jewels, scandal, or things Victorian censors refused to print, this particular journey cemented his place in the history books as someone who looked at a locked door, smiled politely, and picked it with a calligraphy pen and 3 dialects. Sir Richard Francis Burton had many talents. He could blend into foreign cities, quote poetry in Sanskrit, and insult Victorian high society without even trying. But perhaps his most underappreciated skill was his ability to survive things that would immediately end the average person's entire life. Case in point, that time he got a javelin thrown through his jaw and just kept going. It was 1857, and Burton, never one to say no to a death wish disguised as an expedition, set off to solve one of geography's biggest mysteries, the source of the Nile. The mission was grand, dangerous, and completely doomed from the start. The Victorian equivalent of booking a luxury cruise on a ship made of bees and good intentions. His partner, a fellow explorer named John Hanning Speke, who would go on to be both historically important and epically annoyed by Burton's entire existence. The two men had what scientists would call terrible chemistry, the kind usually reserved for reality show contestants who have to share a tent in the jungle. Now, African expeditions at the time weren't exactly spa retreats. Think malaria, dysentery with attitude, wild animals, unfamiliar terrain and hostile encounters, all wrapped in a charming layer of imperial arrogance. But Burton didn't just face logistical nightmares. At one point he was attacked during a conflict with local warriors and promptly received a personalized javelin to the face. The spear entered his cheek and exited near his jaw, making him look like he was trying to pierce his skull from the inside out. The rational response to this would be, "Goodbye world, it's been real." Bert's response. He pulled out the spear, because of course he did, cleaned the wound, and continued his work like he'd simply been mildly inconvenienced by a large splinter. To understand how absurd this is, imagine being stabbed in the face during a camping trip and then calmly asking if the coffee's ready yet. That's Burton, the human version of a Victorian fever dream with a machete and a monograph. The wound never fully healed. For the rest of his life, he carried a visible scar, a reminder that yes, at one point someone threw a spear through his jaw and he simply shrugged it off like a parking ticket. There's no modern equivalent, unless your dentist performs a root canal with a harpoon and then tells you to walk it off. But facial impalement wasn't even the worst of it. The expedition was chaos incarnate. Supplies were mismanaged, the porters were underpaid and understandably unhappy, and Speak and Burton took turns accusing each other of being insufferable. Which, to be fair, might have been true on both counts. They got lost, got sick, got cursed at, and got nowhere fast. Burton was incapacitated by tropical diseases. Speak went temporarily blind. Their medical supplies ran out, their food spoiled, and morale plummeted to levels normally reserved for plague ships and tax audits. Burton, of course, documented everything, every tribal interaction, every specimen, every riverbank they passed, all while looking like someone had tried to turn his skull into a kebab. Because for him, exploration wasn't just a mission, it was an obsessive, fevered pursuit of knowledge, even when the jungle was actively trying to kill him. He didn't just survive Africa, he stared it down, took notes, and probably corrected its grammar. And just to make the whole ordeal even more spicy, the professional feud between Burton and Speak reached new levels of passive-aggressive brilliance. Speak would later claim to have discovered the true source of the Nile, Lake Victoria, while Burton was incapacitated, a claim Burton deeply resented and disputed with the kind of academic fury that could curdle milk. The two never reconciled. Their feud became the stuff of scholarly legend. Burton accused Speak of stealing credit. Speak accused Burton of being an arrogant lunatic. Victorian scientists took sides like it was the science department's version of a wrestling match. Still, even amid the drama, dehydration and facial punctures, Burton never lost his spark. Most men would have tapped out after the first bout of dysentery, or at the very latest after the face spear incident. But Burton, he kept going, kept studying, kept writing, because for him, exploration wasn't about comfort, it was about conquering ignorance with a dictionary in one hand and a compass in the other, regardless of how many orifices were currently leaking blood. If courage is measured in how many spears you can take to the head without quitting, then Sir Richard Francis Burton didn't just raise the bar, he set it on fire, hurled it into the jungle, and drew a map to where it landed. If Victorian-era exploration was a dinner party, Sir Richard Francis Burton and John Hanning Speak would have been the two guests who showed up in matching outfits and immediately tried to stab each other with dessert forks. Their names are forever linked in the annals of British imperial geography, and not because they liked each other. No, Burton and Speak are remembered as one of the most dysfunctional duos to ever wander across a continent together, and then spend the rest of their lives arguing about it in increasingly dramatic ways. Their partnership began with promise, and ended like a particularly vicious round of Victorian academia meets Real Housewives. It all started in 1856, when the Royal Geographical Society decided to send a team to East Africa to find the long-fabled source of the Nile. The idea was simple. Two capable men, both experienced in travel and survival, would pool their skills and tackle the mystery together. What could go wrong? Spoiler: everything. Absolutely everything. From the moment Burton and Speak set foot on African soil, it was clear they were not going to be besties. Burton was the polyglot intellectual, fond of Arabic poetry, brothel ethnography, and snubbing anyone who thought cricket was a personality. Speke was the more traditional British officer, stoic, less cerebral, and deeply suspicious of anything that smelled like culture. They were a terrible match. Think Oscar Wilde forced to backpack with Bear Grylls. The expedition, plagued by logistical nightmares, disease, and general Victorian chaos, quickly became a series of escalating passive-aggressive power struggles. Burton, ever the note-taker and journaler, found Speke's approach to navigation somewhere between sloppy and offensive. Speke, on the other hand, thought Burton was arrogant, pretentious, and far too comfortable in native garb. By the time they reached Lake Tanganyika, both men were too exhausted, injured, and sick to even fake civility. Speke, recovering from temporary blindness and persistent dysentery, split off on his own and stumbled upon another lake, Victoria. He promptly decided it was the source of the Nile and headed back to Britain to announce the news. The only problem, he didn't wait for Burton. Worse, he didn't even tell Burton. Back in London, Speke gave a triumphant lecture to the Royal Geographical Society, presenting his findings and casually sidelining Burton like he was the intern who held the map. Burton, still convalescing and unaware that he'd been publicly ghosted, returned to discover his name was already an academic footnote. Cue the scholarly rage. Burton did not take the snub well. His rebuttals began in polite society publications and escalated into full-blown war. He tore into Speke's conclusions, questioning his measurements, observations, and basic competence. Speke, for his part, retaliated by accusing Burton of being a glory hound who was more interested in exotic languages than hard geography. The two men's feud reached its peak in 1864, when they were scheduled to face off in a public debate at the British Association for the Advancement of Science. It was hyped like a prize fight. Burton prepared reams of data, Speke prepared biting rejoinders. Tickets were metaphorically selling like scones at a scandalous garden party. Then, on the eve of the debate, Speke went out shooting and under deeply mysterious circumstances accidentally shot himself. The bullet went through his chest, killing him instantly. Whether it was suicide or a hunting accident remains the subject of speculation. Victorian decorum whispered accident, but even Burton privately suspected otherwise. The next morning when Burton received the news, he simply said, "He has had the benefit of the doubt." With Speke gone, the feud ended, but not the bitterness. Burton would go on to publish his version of the expedition, brimming with subtle digs and less than subtle accusations. And while Speke was posthumously praised for discovering the Nile's source, Burton refused to concede, suggesting the whole thing had been overblown by a man who couldn't triangulate his own boots. In the grand tradition of academic drama, theirs was not so much a disagreement as a scorched earth campaign. For Burton, exploration was never just about maps and rivers. It was about proving he was the smartest, most daring man in the room. Speke was simply unfortunate enough to try to share that room. In the end, the feud between Burton and Speke wasn't just about geography. It was about ego, class, culture, and two wildly different visions of what it meant to be a Victorian explorer. One saw the world as something to be measured, the other saw it as something to be experienced, recorded, and preferably written about in 5 volumes. The Nile may have been the excuse, but the real journey was straight through the heart of imperial hubris. By the time Richard Francis Burton sat down to translate the Kama Sutra, he had already worn many hats: soldier, spy, linguist, explorer, professional spear catcher, but none would scandalize polite society quite like his stint as a translator of erotic literature. This wasn't some idle project to fill his time between colonial assignments. No, Burton approached the subject of human intimacy with the same meticulous dedication he brought to infiltrating Mecca or surviving Africa's various pointy dangers. And much like his earlier escapades, Victorian England was unprepared. To understand the full impact, you first need to understand just how repressed the 19th century really was. This was an era where table legs were sometimes covered with modesty cloths, lest they awaken unseemly thoughts. And here came Burton, bold as brass, offering the English public a peek behind the embroidered curtains of ancient Indian erotica. Of course, he couldn't exactly stroll into a London print shop and say, "Hello there, I'd like 500 copies of this deeply unwholesome material, please." Victorian obscenity laws weren't just strict, they were hysterical. Publishing material that even hinted at physical pleasure could land you in court, or worse, in the public eye. So Burton did what any responsible scholar with a dangerous manuscript would do. He founded a secret gentleman's club. No, not that kind of gentleman's club. This one was the Karma Shastra Society, a discreet circle of upper-class men with a scholarly interest in literature that just happened to be spicy enough to make Queen Victoria clutch her pearls. Membership was exclusive, and the publications were technically for private distribution, which in Victorian legalese meant don't ask, don't tell. But Burton didn't treat these texts as scandalous curiosities. He treated them as cultural documents worthy of serious analysis. His footnotes were extensive, his annotations meticulous. He categorized positions the way an entomologist might categorize beetles, with scientific curiosity and a total disregard for anyone's discomfort. His work wasn't about titillation, it was about anthropology. It just so happened to also include instructions for things like the splitting of the bamboo or the congress of a crow. In doing so, he exposed the vast chasm between what Victorians did in private and what they admitted in public. They may have burned his books, banned his translations, and hissed his name in social halls, but they also read his work under the table, sometimes literally. Burton himself said the reaction proved more about the readers than the writer, but it wasn't all polite murmurs and disapproving clergymen. Burton faced real professional risk. Despite his military service, linguistic genius, and decorated exploration career, his pursuit of indecent literature permanently coloured his reputation. The British establishment, ever torn between admiration and embarrassment, could never quite decide whether to knight him or exile him. They eventually did both, more or less. His contemporaries accused him of being vulgar, immoral, and obsessed. Burton's response? Essentially yes, and he believed that to understand a culture you had to understand its beliefs about love, sex, and human connection, not just its churches and empires. In this way, his erotic translations weren't a deviation from his life's work. They were the next logical step in a career defined by plunging headfirst into what everyone else was too afraid to touch. Figuratively, mostly. Of course, Burton being Burton. There were always rumours that he'd gone a bit too method in his research. He never commented on those, and frankly he didn't need to. The work spoke for itself. It spoke in Sanskrit, it spoke in Arabic, and it often spoke in positions that defied Victorian furniture design. His Arabian Nights was particularly bold, restoring the story's original sexuality and earthy humour that earlier translators had stripped away like scandalous wallpaper. Burton saw no shame in the sensual, only shame in denying it. His translation ran over 16 volumes, and some of the footnotes were so detailed they could practically be their own academic discipline. Burtonology, the study of where to put what and why it matters. The Victorian world may have wished he'd stuck to more respectable topics like botany or sheep tax records, but Burton wasn't interested in respectability. He was interested in truth, in experience, and in deflating the smug hypocrisy of a society that believed repression was a virtue. If that meant being remembered as the man who brought the Kama Sutra to England, then so be it. In the end, Richard Burton didn't just translate ancient texts, he cracked open a door, however briefly, into the complexities of human desire that his age refused to acknowledge, and he did it with flair, footnotes, and probably a monocle. If anyone ever thought Victorian diplomacy was a dry, tea-sipping affair filled with polite nods and awkward silences, they clearly never met Sir Richard Francis Burton. In his later years, Burton swapped jungle machetes and caravan camels for velvet waistcoats and formal dinners, but only technically. Because no matter what title was on his letterhead, and there were a few, Burton still approached his career like a man actively allergic to subtlety. Officially, he was Her Majesty's consul in far-flung corners of the empire. first in Fernando Po, modern-day Bioko, off Equatorial Guinea, then in Brazil, Damascus, and finally Trieste. But diplomat was just the label. Burton's real role seemed to be stirring as much chaos as possible without technically committing an act of war. Take Damascus, for instance. When most men arrived at their diplomatic post, they greeted officials, unpacked the brandy, and prayed nothing exploded. Burton, meanwhile, dove straight into reporting corruption, accusing local rulers of extortion, and irritating literally everyone with power. He called out the Ottoman administration for mismanaging religious sites, poked into court politics, and even wrote reports on local sexual customs that read like the anthropology section of a very confused romance novel. And then there were the disguises. Burton had a lifelong habit of dressing up, not just as part of espionage or exploration, but sometimes just to see if he could pull it off. In Damascus, he occasionally wandered the city dressed as a local, blending in with perfect language skills and an impeccable beard, though the moustache choices occasionally raised more eyebrows than his behavior. He didn't do this out of necessity. He did it because he was bored, and Victorian bureaucracy didn't offer enough thrills unless you made your own. This wasn't always well received. His superior officers were less than thrilled with his unconventional methods. They expected clean reports and polite diplomacy. Instead, they got missives that described powerful governors as a fat man who smells of garlic and fear, and detailed public executions, brothel etiquette, and complex tribal hierarchies with the precision of a man who should have been studying butterflies but chose humans instead. His honesty was appreciated by no one, except maybe future historians, who now have footnotes that include things like Bedouin sarcasm and the proper way to cook camel liver. Eventually, all this Victorian cosplay and unfiltered reporting got him booted from Damascus. He was reassigned to Trieste, a city in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, where the most dangerous diplomatic task was probably hosting a mildly tense dinner party. There, Burton found less opportunity to provoke but still managed to be a living scandal. While his peers talked about trade routes, he wrote books that included words like phallic cults and sent dispatches that sounded like they were drafted by a man still high on hashish from an earlier Arabian adventure. His moustache by then had taken on near mythical proportions, a thick, expressive entity that curled and dipped like it too had tales to tell. It was the sort of facial hair that intimidated neighboring consuls and made small children cry. But it fit him. It was dramatic, unnecessary, and a little absurd, just like Burton himself. What makes this chapter of Burton's life so memorable isn't just that he got to wear fancy clothes and sit in foreign embassies. It's that even in a world that rewarded conformity, he refused to become a wallpaper man. While the rest of the diplomatic corps polished their monocles, Burton picked fights with bureaucrats, made friends with thieves, and filed paperwork with the tone of a man itching to escape again. He was a contradiction in a cravat, as likely to write poetry as to expose a smuggling ring. His reports were part ethnographic study, part travelogue, part sarcastic Yelp review. And while many of his peers tried desperately to uphold the illusion of the Empire's moral superiority, Burton preferred to document the gritty underbelly in all its glorious, grimy detail. For a man who could blend in anywhere, he stood out everywhere, even among the decorum-obsessed Victorians. Burton's blend of blunt honesty, adventurous curiosity, and unapologetically offensive charm made him the most interesting man to ever wear a medal while describing the mating habits of desert tribes. Sir Richard Francis Burton died in 1890, finally succumbing to illness after decades of dodging death via spear, snakebite, syphilitic cities, and diplomatic scuffles. He passed away in Trieste, aged 69, a number that would have made him chuckle, given his lifelong interest in the racier corners of human behavior. The man had lived enough lives for 10 other men, and in death, he probably expected to be immortalized through his words, his adventures, and his, let's say, thorough writings on love, lust, and linguistics. Unfortunately, he hadn't factored in one critical element, his wife. Lady Isabel Burton was a devoted spouse. She stood by him through the drama, the disguises, the duels, and the decades of travel. But once he was gone, she decided the world didn't need to see what he'd actually left behind. You see, Burton's legacy was more than just public lectures and printed translations. In his private collection were thousands of pages of unpublished manuscripts, field notes, letters and diaries, many of which delved into topics like Eastern mysticism, secret religious rites, obscure tribal customs, and very frequently, erotic practices, best described as not suitable for Victorian drawing rooms. Lady Isabel took one look at that pile, and with all the righteous fervour of someone scandalized by ankle exposure, set it all on fire. That's not metaphorical. She literally built a bonfire, and tossed in his papers years of work, translations of little-known texts, notes on rituals no outsider had ever witnessed, and an apparently steamy collection of letters that would have made a modern romance novelist blush. She later claimed it was to protect his reputation, which, considering Burton was already famous for sneaking into Mecca, chronicling brothels, translating the Kama Sutra, and coining phrases like the Satanic Zone, his term for regions of the world where he thought same-sex activity was culturally prevalent, was a bit like throwing a tarp over a volcano and hoping it would stop erupting. Historians naturally wept. They still do. The Burton bonfire wasn't just the loss of one man's musings, it was a cultural black hole. No one else had the access Burton had, or the bizarre combination of fluency, fearlessness, and fascination with the forbidden. He wasn't just studying other cultures, he was plunging elbow deep into them, asking uncomfortable questions, and documenting it all in prose that was sometimes clinical, sometimes poetic, and frequently very NSFW. We will never know what he truly witnessed inside Mecca during his disguised pilgrimage. We'll never read his unfiltered opinions on mystical sects, tantric practices, or that one letter about the erotic carvings of ancient India that was reportedly so explicit it could double as marital sabotage, because Isabel, Victorian morals blazing, reduced it all to ash. It took Burton a lifetime to collect the secrets of the world. It took his wife one afternoon to send them up in smoke. Some argue she did it out of love, an attempt to protect him from posthumous scandal. Others believe it was a final power move in a marriage where she was always playing second fiddle to his obsessions. Either way, Lady Isabel left us with a polished, sanitized version of her husband, which is deeply ironic, given that Richard Burton never polished or sanitized anything in his life, especially not his writing. But perhaps that's fitting. Burton lived in contradiction. A Victorian knight who documented taboo rituals, a British diplomat who mocked empire, a man fluent in 30 languages but utterly incapable of small talk. He never truly belonged to the establishment, only flirted with it, while secretly taking notes on its flaws. That his final chapter involves censorship feels tragically poetic. The man who uncovered every mystery was, in the end, turned into one. Today, Burton's legacy lives on in the fragments that survived, the books that made it past the fireplace, the tales historians pieced together, and the whispers of what was lost. And though we may never recover his full archive, we still have his legend, the explorer who crossed continents, challenged taboos, and occasionally wore disguises just because he could. And somewhere in a parallel universe there's a library that didn't burn, where Burton's uncensored manuscripts are still read by very confused, very curious scholars, with raised eyebrows and rapidly fanning notebooks. In the early 1800s, James Holman was on track to become a perfectly respectable, thoroughly unremarkable British naval officer, which in Victorian England was just about the highest compliment you could hope for. Born in 1786 in Exeter, Holman came from a modest but upwardly mobile family and joined the Royal Navy at the age of 12, because apparently nothing screams childhood quite like cannons and rations of rum. By his mid-20s, Holman was a commissioned lieutenant. He had discipline, ambition, and just enough privilege to make a comfortable career out of serving Queen and country. Everything was going according to plan, until it wasn't. Then came the cold, or more specifically a mysterious illness that began with aching joints and escalated to full-blown debilitation. The likely culprit was rheumatism, the early 19th century catch-all term for "we have no idea what's wrong, but it hurts." Holman's hands and feet swelled painfully, his limbs grew stiff, and worst of all, his vision started to fade. By 25, he was completely blind. One moment he was plotting sea routes, the next he was bumping into furniture and being politely shuffled into retirement. And thus began the world's most infuriatingly underestimated adventure. The Royal Navy had a solution, of course, the Naval Knights of Windsor, which sounds dashing, but was basically a royal way of saying, "Here's a bench and a blanket, you're done now." The Knights were a group of disabled officers allowed to live rent-free in Windsor Castle in exchange for praying for the monarch once a day and presumably staying out of trouble the rest of the time. Holman hated it. The daily prayers were tolerable, but the condescending pity, the social isolation, and the enforced idleness, less so. The Victorian attitude toward disability was steeped in the idea that if you couldn't physically contribute to society, you should stay quietly out of sight and let able-bodied folks do the interesting stuff. It was a sort of gentlemanly shelving, and Holman was not built to gather dust. While most people might have seen blindness as a good reason to slow down, Holman took a different approach. He saw it as a scheduling inconvenience. At this point, you'd expect a nice domestic life of reading poetry by the fire and sighing tragically. Instead, Holman announced that he was going to leave Windsor, explore the world, and document everything he couldn't see. Naturally, everyone thought he'd lost his mind. How does a blind man travel the globe in the 1800s? How does he find the boat, let alone the continents? But Holman didn't just have mobility, he had audacity, and an absolute refusal to sit still. He began with the idea that he could study medicine. That alone was outrageous for a blind man in Victorian England, where even mild ambition in the disabled was considered eccentric at best. But Holman went further. He enrolled at the University of Edinburgh and attended lectures on everything from surgery to botany, soaking up knowledge like a sponge with particularly sharp listening skills. He didn't stop there. Soon after, he decided to travel not just for leisure, but to write, research and experience life at full speed. He devised systems of tactile note-taking, relied on sound and smell to navigate cities, and refused to let lack of sight mean lack of insight. In the eyes of society, he was supposed to be done. He was supposed to fade into the background, existing only as a cautionary tale about the fragility of health and the importance of warm socks. But Holman had other plans. He packed his own socks, thank you very much, and walked right out the door. What followed was not just rebellion, it was revolution, one footstep at a time. Because Holman wasn't just about to become a traveller, he was going to become the most widely travelled person of the 19th century, blind, alone, and often 10 steps ahead of people who could see and read the map. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Back in Windsor, after announcing his departure, Holman likely received a mix of horrified stares, confused well-wishes, and at least one letter reminding him there were perfectly nice gardens right there in the castle. But Holman's reply was simple. The world was big, and he was tired of staring at the same four walls. Even if he couldn't see it, he was going to experience it, and document it, and quietly embarrass everyone who had ever pitied him. They expected him to live out his days politely. Instead, James Holman embarked on a life so boldly unconventional that he would make even the most daring of Victorian adventurers look like weekend tourists. So off he went, no sight, no map, and no patience for low expectations, and so begins the life of a man who couldn't see but travelled as though he could see everything. They tried. Really, they did. After James Holman lost his sight in his mid-20s, the British system looked at this once promising naval officer and said, well, that's that then. Into the neatly labelled drawer of invalids handle with pity, he was filed. A small pension, a soft chair, and a future full of long, uneventful afternoons awaited him. All Holman had to do was sit quietly, reminisce about better days, and not cause any trouble. Naturally, he immediately started plotting his escape. Holman was assigned a place at the Naval Knights of Windsor, a stately-sounding institution that was essentially a Victorian-era retirement home for disabled naval officers. Imagine a mix of creaky corridors, polite tea rituals, and a strict daily schedule enforced by men who thought fun was a suspicious word. The idea was that Holman would spend his days in reflective repose, perhaps cultivating a fondness for embroidery or indoor pipe smoking. But instead he took one look at the place and decided he'd rather die adventuring than rot in bureaucratic comfort. It didn't help that the naval knights operated with a thick layer of paternalism. You were expected to be grateful for your quiet exile. But Holman was not content to be a well-fed ghost haunting a well-kept hallway. His mind remained restless, and the world, though shrouded in darkness to him, still called with maddening insistence. Boredom, in Holman's case, wasn't just a passing mood. It was a full-body itch he couldn't scratch. He tried. He tried so hard to fit in. He read voraciously, learned Braille before it was even fashionable. He used raised-line maps and an early tactile alphabet system, and began sketching out ideas that involved more moving than sitting. But even these distractions couldn't mask the stifling predictability of Windsor life. He was like a Formula One engine installed in a rocking chair, so naturally he enrolled at Oxford University. Because why not? If your pension plan bores you, why not toss in some academic prestige and see where the Latin declensions take you? Holman had an insatiable intellectual appetite. He wasn't just looking for activity. He wanted knowledge, purpose, something that made the pulse beat again. Oxford, he thought, might provide that spark. Spoiler alert, it didn't. Holman's time at Oxford was brief, so brief in fact, that he probably hadn't even memorized where all the taverns were before he decided to leave. It wasn't that he couldn't keep up academically, far from it. His mind was razor sharp, and he absorbed ideas like a sponge in a rainstorm. The problem was that academia, at least the 19th century kind, was often more interested in structure than in wonder. It prized quiet study, not dynamic curiosity. And Holman was looking for something a bit more kinetic. Also, let's not forget the charming lack of accessibility at a time when even ramps were considered radical architecture. While Holman was extraordinarily independent, he navigated with a cane, had developed acute memory and spatial awareness, and had an almost magical ability to read his surroundings through sound and smell. Oxford still treated his blindness like an intellectual defect. Professors didn't know what to do with him. Administrators assumed he was a novelty. And fellow students weren't always sure how to interact with the blind man who quoted philosophy and moved through courtyards like he had night vision. And so, after testing the waters of academia and finding them tepid and uninspired, Holman did what he was now becoming famous for. He left again. He gave up his place at Oxford, not out of failure, but from a growing conviction that the world was a better classroom than any ivy-covered lecture hall. From Windsor's cloistered corridors to Oxford's hallowed but limiting halls, Holman had learned one important lesson. If you let society define your limits, you'll spend your life parked in the slow lane, politely applauding other people's adventures. And Holman wanted to be the one causing the adventures, with no degree, no formal plan, and still no eyesight. Holman walked away from the institutions that had tried to contain him. What he did have was a pension barely, a good coat, and a cane that had started to feel less like a mobility aid, and more like a sword of destiny. In his pocket, a notebook. In his mind, a dream to see, metaphorically and spiritually, the world in ways most sighted people never dared. And so he set out once more, not as a dropout or an invalid, but as an escape artist from mediocrity. He'd had a taste of stifled routine, and it had only made his wanderlust stronger. They gave him a quiet room and a pension. He gave them a headache and a resignation letter. When most people lose their eyesight, they spend time adjusting to a new way of life. James Holman, meanwhile, adjusted by packing up his walking stick, saying cheerio to England, and heading off for a solo jaunt across Europe. Because nothing says self-care like being blind and wandering into the Napoleonic aftershocks of continental Europe without a guide. By the early 1820s, Holman had already grown weary of being told what he couldn't do. He'd tried the polite route, retirement at Windsor, a sniff at academia, and the occasional bout of silent suffering, but his legs still worked, and so did his sense of direction, albeit through unconventional methods. So naturally he decided it was time to take a solo tour of Europe. You know, like you do when you're a blind man in the 19th century, and everyone's telling you to sit still, armed with a cane, a resolute sense of direction, and what one could only describe as unbreakable audacity. Holman began his journey in France. The Channel crossing was his first small victory, not because he crossed the sea, but because he did it solo, proving to any doubters that he wasn't some fragile ornament to be kept on a shelf. He was more like a spinning top, unpredictable, fast-moving, and impossible to pin down. His travel method, he relied heavily on the power of attention, not the kind one gets from fame, but the intense awareness of his other senses. He described hearing the echo of voices in a narrow street and knowing he was close to a cathedral. He could smell the change in the air when he entered a marketplace. Spices, bread, and livestock were as good as any signpost. Cobbled roads had their own rhythm, and if he got really stuck, he simply asked someone. Though he preferred to observe and deduce, most of his navigation came down to one thing: confidence. Confidence and an uncanny ability to identify Italian gelato shops by aroma alone. To the locals, Holman was an enigma. In France, they thought he was perhaps a wandering holy man. In Italy, some mistook him for a mystic. In Switzerland, where things are generally more straightforward, they simply assumed he was insane. After all, here was a man without sight, strolling confidently through cities, climbing stairs, avoiding carts, and even reportedly leading sighted travelers through wooded paths based on memory and echo. Holman once claimed he could tell when a carriage was approaching by the subtle change in road vibrations through his walking stick. At this point, he wasn't just traveling, he was basically a Victorian bat, and yet, despite the skepticism, or maybe because of it, Holman made friends in surprising places. People were often confused, but also intrigued. He wasn't asking for pity or charity, just directions and occasionally dinner. He was genuinely interested in the world around him and soaked up culture, customs, and languages like a sponge. A very determined British sponge with a notebook. One of the most remarkable aspects of his European travels was how little he relied on others. He didn't have an entourage, no servant, no assistant, occasionally a helpful stranger, sure, but for the most part, he was an army of one. If he got lost, he didn't panic. He stopped, listened, sniffed the air, and recalibrated. He treated foreign cities the way a detective treats a crime scene. Carefully, analytically, and with unnerving precision. That said, he wasn't immune to mishaps. Once in Venice, he accidentally wandered into a convent garden, thinking it was a public park. The nuns, understandably startled by the sudden appearance of a cane-tapping Englishman among the azaleas, quickly escorted him out. Holman apologized profusely, charmed them with his manners, and was later invited back for tea, because of course he was. But Holman's travels weren't just about proving something to himself. They were about learning, recording, and in some cases, correcting misconceptions. He wrote detailed journals on the soundscape of cities, the social customs he encountered, and even the fashion trends, by touch, of course. His observations were sharp, insightful, and occasionally brutal. He didn't romanticize Europe, he documented it, quirks and all. By the time he returned to England after his first tour, Holman had already walked, ridden, sailed, and clattered across more of Europe than most of his sighted peers, and he wasn't even close to being done. For many Victorians, Europe was a place of postcards and second-hand stories. For James Holman, it was a three-dimensional sensory adventure. He didn't just visit, he absorbed. He didn't just pass through, he mapped. Not with ink and grid lines, but with footsteps, echoes, and instincts. In a world where travel was supposed to be visual, Holman reminded everyone that seeing the world didn't require eyes, just the will to keep moving forward. If you're blind, trekking across Europe solo is already enough to raise a few Victorian eyebrows. But deciding to waltz into Tsarist with nothing but a walking stick, a notebook, and an incurable case of wanderlust, now that's how you get international attention. and not the good kind. By the early 1820s, James Holman was already becoming a legend in whispers, the blind traveller who didn't know how to stay home. After conquering Western Europe on foot, he set his sights on something grander, a journey eastward across, possibly all the way to the fabled lands of Siberia. Because, of course, when you're blind and British in the 19th century, the next logical step after tea and Italy is a solo adventure through snow-covered authoritarian bureaucracy. But that place, a land of vast distances, endless winters, and a paranoia that could frost over a samovar. Holman arrived with optimism, but they received him like a package labelled highly suspicious, probably full of spies. Holman entered intending to travel overland to the far reaches of Siberia, a feat few could claim, and even fewer would voluntarily attempt. But to the officials, this wasn't the charming story of a blind man defying the odds. This was deeply suspicious behavior. After all, what kind of man with no eyesight volunteers to navigate frozen forests, unpronounceable villages and roads that sometimes disappeared under wolves? Their conclusion: clearly he was a British spy. Yes, really. To their credit, Holman did fit no typical category. He was an Englishman alone. He asked a lot of questions. He took copious notes, and he walked with such uncanny confidence that people couldn't believe he wasn't seeing anything at all. Bureaucrats began whispering, "He's faking it," because in the suspicious mind of early 19th century intelligence, pretending to be blind was an excellent espionage strategy, and so Holman, bless his utterly baffled soul, became the first man accused of espionage by being too disabled to be real. The detainment itself wasn't exactly dramatic. There were no secret police bursting into a room or dark alley interrogations. Instead, Holman was quietly told he would no longer be allowed to proceed with his travels. His official visa was revoked, and instead of a cozy ride to the next city, he was firmly shuffled back westward, all the way to the edge of the empire. Holman tried reasoning, he tried explaining, he probably even tried out-charming them, something that had worked wonders on innkeepers and customs agents all across Europe, but they was having none of it. In the eyes of Tsarist bureaucracy, Holman was a walking contradiction. He was blind but independent. He was disabled but daring. He was collecting information without any visible agenda, which of course made him far more dangerous than someone with an obvious one. Why would a blind man travel alone through Siberia, they asked, nervously glancing at his walking stick like it might be a disguised radio transmitter. What does he really want? But Holman's exile didn't silence him. Far from it. He recorded everything, not just his detainment, but the nuances of society he had experienced before they booted him. The smells of Orthodox churches, the sounds of folk songs drifting through the market squares, the way certain words echoed differently off palace walls. He didn't need sight to notice power, structure or tension, and he didn't need permission to remember. His return to Europe wasn't a surrender, it was a strategic retreat with a notebook full of gold. He later published his experiences, and while he had to tone down the political bits for fear of ruffling the feathers of international diplomacy, the message was clear. He'd gone to the edge, and he'd seen, or rather sensed, more than most ever would. Holman's encounter with suspicion was just one of many times bureaucracy would fumble in the face of his unexplainable competence. He didn't fit any government form. He wasn't a soldier, missionary, merchant or official, and yet he crossed mountains, borders and languages with nothing but curiosity and a memory sharp enough to embarrass most travel writers. To the authorities, he was a spy without a disguise. To the people who met him on the road, he was a mystery wrapped in a blanket, holding a stick and asking insightful questions about local agriculture. And to Holman, he was just getting started. By the time most people are deciding what color curtains to hang in their living room, James Holman was deciding whether to take the long way around Africa or dive into the jungles of South America. Why? Because he'd already crossed Europe, been thrown out of for being suspiciously blind, and was now firmly allergic to staying put. The man had turned global travel into a full-time job, despite having no sight, no sponsors, and no real plan, just a stubborn refusal to let common sense ruin a good adventure. To understand just how ambitious this was, let's pause and look at the 19th century travel landscape. It was not, to put it mildly, user-friendly. There were no Google Maps, and definitely no wheelchair ramps or disability accommodations. Travel was slow, uncomfortable, and frequently fatal, and yet Holman decided to visit every continent. Not figuratively, literally. He circumnavigated the globe, a feat so absurd for a blind man in his era that many refused to believe it even happened. And honestly, if Holman hadn't been so meticulous in his journals, we might think it was fiction too. He started with Africa, not the safari tour version, but the real hot, dusty, colonial tension-filled Africa. Holman didn't just dip a toe into the continent, he waded right in places like the Cape Colony, modern-day South Africa. He mingled with governors, soldiers and locals alike, learning as much as possible through conversation, scent, texture, and even the change in air pressure. Most people see the world through their eyes. Holman developed a mental map based on footsteps, ambient sound and temperature shifts. His world was layered in a way sighted people rarely perceive. From Africa, he journeyed to Asia, including the islands of Southeast Asia and India, which was a humid tangle of chaos, heat, and colonial confusion. There, Holman explored cities crowded with ox carts, snake charmers, British officers, and far too many insects. But where most travelers might have melted into a puddle of frustration, Holman found rhythm in the sensory orchestra. He could hear a market before he entered it, recognize a building by its echo, and learn languages by sheer immersion. He adapted in ways no one expected, often faster than his sighted companions. His stop in Australia was equally daring. This was not the modern Australia with koala selfies and beach hostels. This was penal colony Australia, where everything either bit, stung, or tried to eat you. Holman spent time with convicts, settlers, and indigenous peoples, documenting the social structures and absurdities of colonial life with the kind of detail that made armchair travelers in England gasp. The fact that he could paint such vivid verbal pictures without seeing any of it was a kind of literary magic that baffled critics and delighted readers. And then came South America. Jungle, altitude, bugs the size of house pets. Holman trudged through landscapes so unforgiving they scared off experienced explorers, let alone one without sight. But he had developed an almost supernatural ability to read the terrain. Locals often assumed he had second sight or magical powers. Some treated him with reverence. Others just scratched their heads and asked if he was lost. He usually wasn't. One of Holman's favorite tools was his trusty sword cane, a perfectly Victorian invention that combined a mobility aid with a subtle threat, part walking stick, part weapon. It was the Swiss Army knife of blind travel accessories. He probably never had to use it for defense, but it added an undeniable flair to his persona. Imagine explaining that to airport security today. And yet, despite all the country's climates and cultural barriers, Holman didn't travel for fame or fortune. He traveled because standing still felt like death. He wrote obsessively, his journals packed with detail, humor, observation, and empathy. In some regions, he was the first Englishman to document certain customs. He didn't take snapshots, he took mental portraits. Rich, textured accounts of a world few Britons could imagine. Of course, not everyone back home understood the scale of what he was doing. Some critics assumed he was just relaying stories he'd heard. Others doubted a blind man could absorb so much. But those who met him, really talked to him, knew Holman wasn't seeing the world. He was sensing it, experiencing it with every nerve, every sound, every texture beneath his fingers and footfall. He was, in every possible way, a one-man expedition. No entourage, no lavish funding, just raw curiosity and an iron will. James Holman's method of travel was less by the book and more by the breeze, banter, and bump on the forehead. For a man who couldn't see, he had an extraordinary way of moving through the world, not as a passive recipient of help, but as a one-man cartographic tornado, armed with questions, a cane, and a memory that made steel traps look lazy. Picture this: a Victorian gentleman with a sword cane, walking briskly down the cobbled streets of an unfamiliar city, confidently turning corners as if he owned them. No guide, no seeing-eye dog, just years of training his other senses to take the wheel, and an attitude that whispered, "Blindness? That's cute. Watch this." Holman's ability to read his environment was nothing short of genius. He relied heavily on what he called tactile observation, which meant running his hands along architecture, walls, trees, or occasionally startled livestock. The tap of his cane wasn't just to avoid potholes. It echoed off buildings and gave him a rough map of the space around him, not unlike a human version of sonar. And in a feat of unintentional comedy and pure innovation, Holman could often tell how crowded or narrow a street was based on how loudly conversations bounced back toward him. This echolocation-style technique might sound like the stuff of comic books, but to Holman it was simply how he traveled. A quiet courtyard, likely surrounded by stone walls and small fountains. A bustling street, that meant market stalls. Overheard gossip, maybe the distant clatter of hooves on cobblestones. All of it logged, interpreted, and stored in his mental atlas. It's like GPS, but Victorian, human-powered, and far more accurate than your phone in a tunnel. His shoulders also got in on the action. Holman reportedly used the sensation of wind, ambient temperature, and even changes in humidity to gauge altitude and open space. He could tell you when he was entering a forest based on the scent and the way the light changed the feel of the air on his face. He could feel stone giving way to moss beneath his boots. And if he smacked into a tree, well, that was just bonus data. But it wasn't all elbows and instincts. Holman was also a conversational maestro. He had the disarming charm of someone who genuinely listened, perhaps because, unlike most 19th century gentlemen, he couldn't afford not to. He struck up conversations with innkeepers, merchants, monks, soldiers, camel drivers, you name it. His questions were astute and often phrased better than the diplomats who followed him. He wasn't just asking where the road led, he wanted to know who built it, how often it flooded, and which side of the mountain goats preferred. And then he remembered everything, entire cultural details, political dynamics and topographies, would later spill out in his writing, astonishing readers who couldn't believe the information came from someone who hadn't seen a thing. One particularly famous moment involved Holman describing in detail the color variations of a mountain range in South Africa. A flustered observer asked him how he possibly knew what colors he was referring to. Holman coolly responded that while he could no longer see them, he remembered colors from before he lost his sight, and besides, enough people had described the hue to him that he knew it better than some sighted people did. It was the visual equivalent of memorizing a novel in Braille, and then correcting someone else's summary of it. He also used the written word as a tool of travel. Holman took obsessive notes, not just on what he experienced, but on the differences between what he was told and what he could sense. He'd annotate scents, local dialects, tactile textures of fabrics or stones, and even the way a country's cuisine sounded when eaten. A boiling pot in China didn't hiss like one in London. That, to Holman, was worth recording. And perhaps most astonishing of all was how he put all these elements together. He once navigated a complex temple site by following the echo of his own footsteps and the shifting density of incense in the air. Another time, he helped a sighted friend find a road out of the forest, based entirely on bird sounds and the feel of the dirt path beneath their feet. There's being competent, and then there's guiding someone else with your ears. To most people, travel is a visual experience. We take photos, we admire views, we get lost in beautiful horizons. Holman didn't have that option, so he built a new one. He turned a world designed for the eyes into one that whispered, rumbled, and breathed its way into his memory. His journey was like listening to the world's greatest podcast, with every street, storm, and stranger giving him another episode. By the time James Holman had racked up more miles than most 19th century empires, you'd think the Royal Geographical Society would have thrown him a medal, a handshake, and maybe a tea set engraved with "World's Most Persistent Wanderer." Instead, Holman received something much colder, polite applause, followed by a firm and frosty shut door. Not metaphorically, literally. The doors of elite British geography remained quite closed to a man whose only apparent disqualification was that he didn't eyeball the continents he explored. Founded in 1830, the Royal Geographical Society was a gentleman's club with a cartographic obsession, but like all gentlemen's clubs of the era, it was heavy on the gentleman and light on the inclusivity. Its members were mostly upper class, sighted, and prone to viewing exploration as an armchair pursuit, ideally with maps, cigars and sherry. Into this environment walked with a cane and astounding travel journals James Holman, naval veteran, global traveller, and chronic thorn in the society's monocled side. To be clear, the RGS didn't completely ignore Holman. They acknowledged him, awkwardly, like someone nodding to a party crasher who brought the best snacks. His books were occasionally reviewed, his travels begrudgingly mentioned, but the society never formally inducted him, never funded his journeys, and never included him in the elite inner circle that shaped British geography for decades. Why? Ostensibly blindness. But Holman's disability was less a genuine obstacle and more of a convenient excuse. Behind the curtains of condescension were deeper fears that this man, uninvited and inconvenient, had outperformed every one of them. He had done what they wrote papers about. He had been there. They had theories. He had memories. Classism played its part too. Holman wasn't from the aristocracy. His naval background, his lack of inherited wealth, and his tendency to travel alone without the proper entourage of botanists, valets and sketch artists made him suspiciously unpolished for their tastes. Worse, he wasn't traveling on their dime. Independent success always smells a little sour in rooms where prestige is handed down like cufflinks. There was also the uncomfortable fact that Holman wrote too well. His travelogues, full of rich sensory descriptions and sharp cultural insights, were popular among the reading public. Too popular. They outsold more respectable explorers' accounts, which often resembled footnotes stretched into volumes. Holman's vivid prose, his humour, and his philosophical tone made him an accidental celebrity, the sort that didn't ask permission. The RGS, meanwhile, preferred explorers who either died impressively or returned broken and humble. Holman did neither. He just kept moving. Even when the society did begrudgingly acknowledge Holman's accomplishments, they seemed unsure how to classify him. Blind and brilliant, made for good copy, but internally the contradictions seemed to short-circuit their social algorithms. How could a man without sight describe cities, mountains, temples, and people with such precision? There were whispers, even insinuations, that perhaps he wasn't fully blind, as though faking total blindness for decades and across continents was more plausible than just admitting he was in fact extraordinary. And so the cold shoulder hardened, despite covering more ground than nearly anyone in history. Holman was never officially backed by the society. No medals, no honorary titles, no warm write-ups in the quarterly journal. Just silence, the kind that grows louder the more remarkable your achievements become. This didn't stop Holman, of course. He didn't need their approval, though he certainly deserved it. While they plotted expeditions with budgets and government backing, he simply packed up, adjusted his sword cane, and departed. Again, Holman's philosophy was direct. The world was big, life was short, and one didn't need a club's permission to discover either. His treatment speaks volumes, not just about institutional blindness, but the Victorian era's discomfort with people who refused to stay in the boxes society built for them. Holman was blind, yes, but he refused to be pitied, limited, or defined by that. And that kind of audacity was, for the men in tailored waistcoats, the most unforgivable trait of all. In the grand parade of historical figures, James Holman didn't just walk, he practically sprinted blindfolded while everyone else rode in horse-drawn carriages. Yet, when the credits rolled on the 19th century, his name was left off the marquee. The man who had travelled more miles than Marco Polo, documented more continents than Darwin, and done it all without the aid of sight, was quietly tucked away by history like a well-worn map, left in a dusty attic. Holman died in 1857 at the age of 70, a respectable lifespan for the era, especially for someone who had spent so much of it bouncing across disease-ridden ports, imperial jungles, and snowy wastelands with only a walking stick and encyclopedic memory as armor. But death came with an unfortunate side effect: historical amnesia. There were no grand memorials, no statues in Trafalgar Square, not even a polite bronze plaque. The man who had been dubbed the Blind Traveller simply vanished from the popular imagination. Part of the problem was timing. Victorian England was heading into its golden age of imperial chest-thumping, and the kinds of explorers the public loved were loud, wealthy, and preferably tangled in some sort of scandal involving large game or native misunderstandings. Holman, for all his astonishing achievements, was a humble man who relied on listening instead of conquering. Worse, he was blind, which for many Victorian readers was reason enough to consider his feats less valid. It's difficult to slap an image of someone reading a landscape with their feet onto the front page when the public was salivating over lion hunts and treasure maps. And let's not forget the publishing world. Holman's books, though detailed and thoughtful, lacked the drama and imperial flair that made others into bestsellers. His writing was more anthropological than bombastic. He described local customs with precision and respect, often prioritizing daily life over colonial bragging rights. He didn't plant flags. He asked questions. And in a literary market addicted to adventure in the pulp fiction sense, his narratives were just too human. By the end of the 19th century, his volumes were out of print, gathering dust in the back rooms of obscure libraries. Meanwhile, lesser-travelled men, some who barely left their hometowns, enjoyed full careers as explorers simply because they had the right education, social pedigree, or flair for theatrical exaggeration. Holman had none of those. What he had was experience, talent, and a spine made of reinforced iron. But that didn't help when publishers were looking for scandal and swords, not quiet brilliance and walking sticks. It wasn't until the late 20th century that Holman's story began to resurface, thanks in part to historians who were finally willing to dig past the surface of imperial puffery. Biographers stumbled across his forgotten works, and upon opening them, collectively gasped. Wait, he did what? They found a man who had mapped his way across empires using only sensory impressions, who had recorded details that even seasoned sighted travelers missed, and who had done it all with such modesty that he rarely put himself at the center of his own story. Modern scholars began to see Holman not just as an anomaly, but as a trailblazer, someone who defied the boundaries of ability, class, and empire. He became a symbol of what true curiosity looked like when stripped of ego. His reappearance in academic circles sparked new interest in how we define exploration, how we value sensory experience, and how we overlook those who don't fit neatly into heroic molds. Still, outside the scholarly bubble, Holman remains a mystery to most. He hasn't gotten the Hollywood treatment. No biopic, no Netflix miniseries starring a British heartthrob learning echolocation. His legacy is still in the process of being reclaimed, piece by piece, book by book, footstep by metaphorical footstep. But perhaps Holman wouldn't have minded. He didn't travel to be known. He traveled to know. His journeys were not acts of self-promotion, but of self-liberation, a defiant refusal to let blindness be a boundary. And while the world may have temporarily forgotten him, history has a way of circling back. After all, Holman always knew how to navigate in the dark. James Holman may not have been able to see the world, but the world is finally starting to see him. Though long overlooked, his story has re-emerged like a postcard from the past that took a very scenic route. In an age when travel influencer often means beach selfies and rented jets, Holman stands apart as the original globe-trotting maverick armed with a walking stick, a boundless sense of curiosity, and absolutely no time for anyone's low expectations. Today, Holman is being rediscovered not just as a remarkable traveller, but as a pioneering figure in the fields of accessibility, resilience, and self-determination. Long before disability rights became a formal movement, Holman was busy bulldozing through social norms, politely of course, and with a well-documented itinerary. His message wasn't wrapped in hashtags or talks, but it resonates louder than ever. The limits people put on you are often far smaller than the ones you can break. Holman didn't wait for permission or accommodations. He created his own methods, counting footsteps, measuring echoes, feeling architectural changes through his cane, and engaging locals in conversation that usually began with, "So what's this building I just ran into?" He didn't demand the world change for him. He showed how to dance with it, clumsy waltz or not. In modern accessibility conversations, Holman is something of a time-traveling ambassador. Adaptive travel, once seen as impossible or impractical, is now recognized as essential and empowering. Holman was centuries ahead of the curve. He didn't need visual confirmation to describe the shimmer of Venetian canals or the bustle of Canton's markets. He relied on voices, weather shifts, changes in air pressure, the smell of spices, and the instinct that comes only from moving through the world with total trust in one's mind and body. He was, in essence, echolocating before it was cool, and no, he didn't have an app for that. What can modern travelers, sighted or otherwise, learn from Holman? For starters, curiosity beats convenience. His journeys were not about luxury, but about connection, cultural immersion, and discovering the unknown. He took the long way, the hard way, the "what do you mean this isn't a road" way. And in doing so, he created a version of travel that was rich in texture, literally. More importantly, Holman upends the tired stereotype that disability equals limitation. He was a veteran, a scholar, a published author, and a relentless traveler. He wasn't just good for a blind man, he was excellent by any standard. He didn't need sight to observe. He didn't need permission to roam. His confidence was earned, not inherited. In a world that still struggles to understand the full capabilities of people with disabilities, Holman is not a footnote, he's a blueprint. And yes, he's still more interesting than 99% of influencers with ring lights, drone footage and Wi-Fi that actually works in the jungle. Historians today have begun to correct the record, peeling back the layers of Victorian dismissal and recognizing the scale of Holman's accomplishments. Travel writers cite him as a forgotten icon. Disability advocates hold him up as an early warrior for independence. And readers, they're just astonished that this man who couldn't see a map managed to redraw the boundaries of possibility with every step. His story isn't just a curiosity, it's a challenge. It asks, what are you waiting for? If a man in the 1800s lacking both sight and social support could traverse the globe and chronicle its wonders, then surely we can manage to explore our own lives with a bit more courage. James Holman didn't need vision to have vision. His passport may have been ink-stamped into oblivion, but his legacy is finally becoming indelible. He proved that travel isn't about what you see, it's about how far you're willing to go to understand. And judging by his journals, it's also about how many languages you can mispronounce along the way.